In today's session, we are going to be focusing on more advanced controllers. We will talk about the if controller, while controller, runtime controller, interleave controller, and finally, the random controller. Let's start with the if controller. The if controller works like the if operator of the programming language. If the condition defined is true, then the elements under the if controller will be executed. Let's see an example in JMeter. So in this script, we have a thread group with one user and 10 iterations. Then we created a config element, which is the random variable, which the aim is to create a variable, which the name is random value, and the value will be a random number between 1 and 100. Then we have the if controller, and the if controller condition is saying that if the random value generated is less than 50, then the condition is true and it will go inside the if controller. Inside the if controller, we have a dummy sampler, which is going to have on the request data the random value generated, and we will see also which is the iteration number. Finally, we have a second dummy sampler, which is not inside the if controller, and it will be executed always, no matter the condition of the if controller. So let's run once this test and see the results. If we first check the first request, the random value generated is 11, which is less than 50, the condition that we set on the if controller. So the dummy sampler inside the if controller is executed. The dummy sampler always is always executed. If we check the second iteration, iteration number 2, the random value is 56, and this means that the dummy sampler inside the if controller is not executed. But for iteration number 3, the random value is satisfying the if condition. For this example, we use a really simple condition. We are just checking that the number is less than 50, but you can actually create and write very complex condition in JavaScript or Groovy, or even interpreting this condition as a variable expression by clicking on this option. Let's move on to the while controller. In JMeter, the while controller basically runs the children samplers inside it, unless some predetermined condition is true, where we can define this condition in different ways. So let's go into our script, where we will have a thread group, and inside the thread group we have the while controller. We can define this condition in different ways. The first option that we will try is to leave it blank, and in this case, the while controller will exit when the last sampler in the loop fails. So how can we reproduce that? Inside the while controller, I created a dummy sampler, which will be executed unless the condition fails. So if in this dummy sampler, we have a latency, which is a random number generated between 1 and 50. So I added a post-processor to this dummy sampler. I will show you quickly. And this post-processor, what it's doing, it's checking if the latency is greater than 40. And if it is greater than 40, then this sampler will be marked as not successful. So when we run this test, if for one of the samplers the latency is greater than 40, then the sampler will fail and the condition of the while controller will fail. So let's run this test. Okay, so if we check the first request, the latency is 22, it's okay. The second is 25. And if we check the third latency, it's 46. So this dummy sampler is failing and it is exiting the while controller. Another option that we have is to write the word last. And this is the same as leaving it blank, but with an additional check for the last sampler before the loop result. So if the sampler preceding the controller is not successful, the while controller and its children won't be executed at all. So let's reproduce this example. Let's add another dummy sampler, which will be before the while controller. Okay, so this dummy sampler, this is before. And let's run it once with a successful example. Let's clean it. So this is the dummy sampler before, and then it is failing when latency is greater than 40. Now let's check this option to make the dummy sampler before the while controller not successful. Let's run again this example. And we can see that the dummy sampler before the while controller is failing, so it is not even executing the while controller samplers. Okay. Finally, another option that we have to declare our condition is to use a JMeter function, JMeter variable, or JMeter property. And unlike the if controller, which automatically interprets this condition as JavaScript, in the while controller, it expects it to be either true or false. So we need to use a JavaScript function or a similar function in order to compare the variable value to something. In our example, I created a counter, which is going from 1 to 100, and the while controller is having a function which is checking if the counter is less than 3. When the counter is greater than 3, then the samplers inside the while controller won't be executed. And let's run again this example. And we can see only 2 samplers, as when it reaches the counter number 3, it is exiting the while controller. The next controller we will discuss is the runtime controller, which executed samplers inside it only for a period of time specified in the controller settings. In our script, we will have a runtime controller, and we said that this controller will run only for 5 seconds. Inside the runtime controller, we have a while controller with an empty condition, which means that it will run forever until some of the failures inside it fails, correct? So we have a dummy sampler, which will always be successful. So if we didn't specify any runtime controller and we only have the while controller, this test will run infinitely forever. But we said that it will run only for 5 seconds. Let's run it once. Okay, so it is running. And now the test stopped because we have reached the 5 seconds. The next controller is the interleave controller. And what is the goal of the interleave controller? So the main aim is to alternate between the controllers or components which are inside this controller. And let's quickly see an example to understand how it works. We have a thread group, and inside the thread group, I added an interleave controller. Inside that interleave controller, we have 3 dummy samplers, and then outside this interleave controller, we have an extra dummy sampler, which will always be executed. For this thread group, I define one user with 3 iterations. Let's run this test and understand what happened. So the first thread will execute on the first loop dummy sampler number 1, and always the dummy sampler which is not included on the interleave controller. Then for loop 2, it will execute dummy sampler 2 and the always dummy sampler, and for the loop 3, it will execute the dummy sampler number 3. We have different options in the interleave controller. The first option is to ignore the subcontroller blocks, so we can ignore any type of controller which is inside the interleave controller. And then we have the second option, which if we check it, it will interleave across threads. And what does it mean? Let's run the first example without checking this option. If we go into the thread group, now instead of having 1 thread, I will use 3 threads, and each thread will only do 1 loop. So let's run this test and understand what happened. Only dummy sampler number 1 is executed. Now, what if we choose to interleave across the threads? Let's run it again and see how the 3 samplers are being executed. Our last controller is the random order controller. And for this controller, it will make sure that each child is executed at least 1, but in a random order. So if we check our script, we have the same dummy samplers, but now we are using the random order controller. This means that the 3 samplers will be executed, but we don't know in which order they are going to be executed. So let's run this test and see that the order will vary. So here it's dummy sampler 2, 3, 1, and for the next iteration, the order is 1, 3, 2, and then 1, 2, 3. But For each of the iterations, the 3 damage samplers are executed.